He had one interview, one folder, and one little girl who believed in him more than he believed in himself. One wrong button, one rushed decision, and his entire life was about to collide with hers. 40 floors up, and he had no idea he was about to walk straight into the one face he never thought he'd see again. She had built an empire trying to forget him. And there he was, standing in her lobby, holding his daughter's hand. 10 years of silence, one wrong elevator, and a single dad's whole world was about to change forever. Marcus Reed had $37 in his checking account, one clean shirt left on its hanger, and exactly one shot at an interview that could change everything. If you've ever walked into a room with everything riding on you and nothing left to lose, stay with this story until the very end. Because the elevator Marcus stepped into that morning didn't just take him to the wrong floor. It took him straight into the one face he had spent 10 years trying to forget. And if stories like this move you, hit like and subscribe right now, because where this one goes next, you will not see coming. It was a Thursday morning in late autumn, the kind of gray, low-hanging sky that made the glass towers downtown look like they were scraping the clouds themselves. Marcus stood on the sidewalk outside Cross Tower, one of the tallest buildings in the financial district, holding his 6-year-old daughter Zoe's hand in one of his and a thin folder of resumes in the other. He'd been laid off from the packaging plant 4 months earlier when the company relocated its operations overseas. And since then, every week had become a quiet, exhausting exercise in stretching what little money remained while sending out application after application into a silence that never answered back. This interview, a maintenance technician position with the building's facilities company, was the first callback he'd gotten in 6 weeks. So he couldn't afford for it to go wrong, and yet he also couldn't afford childcare, which was the only reason Zoe was standing beside him that morning instead of at school. So, clutching her worn teddy bear biscuit against her chest, like she always did when she sensed her father was nervous, even if she couldn't have explained why. The 4 months since the layoff had worn Marcus down in ways he tried hard to hide from his daughter. He'd sold his truck to cover 2 months of rent, taken to walking Zoe to a neighbor's Kurt's apartment before dawn on the mornings he picked up day labor shifts, and learned, with a kind of grim precision, exactly how far a single grocery budget could stretch when it had to. He kept a small spiral notebook in his jacket pocket, where he tracked every dollar, every bill due date, every application sent, a habit that had become less about organization and more about proving to himself, night after night, that he was still doing everything a good father was supposed to do, even when the results refused to show it. He hadn't told Zoe how close they'd come, twice that autumn, to falling behind on rent. He hadn't told anyone. There wasn't really anyone left to tell. Marcus hadn't always lived like this. 10 years earlier, he'd been a bright, ambitious economics student with a full academic scholarship, working nights at a campus coffee shop to cover the gaps his scholarship didn't. It was there, behind that espresso machine, that he'd met Vivian Cross, a driven, quietly fierce business major who used to sit in the corner booth every evening with a laptop covered in sticky notes, working on what she called half joking and half serious, her someday empire. They'd fallen in love slowly and completely, the way people do at 22, when the future still feels like something you get to choose. They talked about starting a company together one day. They talked about a lot of things they never got the chance to build. Everything changed in Marcus's final year of school, when his father's small construction business collapsed under a mountain of debt neither of them had seen coming. His father's health broke down alongside the business, a stress-triggered heart condition that required expensive ongoing care, and Marcus, the only child, made the decision no 22-year-old should have to make alone. He dropped out 1 semester before graduation, took the first steady-paying job he could find, and quietly, without much explanation, ended things with Vivian. He told her he needed space to figure things out. What he didn't tell her, what he could barely admit to himself, was that he couldn't stand the idea of her watching him fall from the future there far, pre-fiddled from hand, together, into a life of overdue bills and double shifts. He told himself it was a kindness, letting her go before she had to watch him struggle. He spent the next decade wondering if it had been the biggest mistake of his life. He remembered the exact conversation, 10 years later, with an unwelcome clarity. A bench outside the library, a cold March wind, Vivian's face going still and careful, in the particular way it did when she was trying not to let someone see how much something had hurt her. She hadn't cried, not in front of him. She'd asked him, quietly, if there was someone else. And when he said no, she'd asked if it was about the money, about his father, about all the things he'd weigh, without ever letting her help carry them too. He'd lied and said no to that too, because the truth felt too large and too humiliating to say out loud. That he'd rather she remember him as the boy who loved her completely than watch him become the man who couldn't provide for anyone, including himself. She had walked away that day without another word, and Marcus had told himself, for years afterward, that her silence meant she'd understood. He would come to learn, a decade later, that it had meant nothing of the kind. He met Elena 2 years later, working the same warehouse shift as him, a warm, steady woman who loved him without needing him to be anything more than exactly who he already was. They married, and 3 years after that, Zoe was born. And for a while, life felt like it had found its footing again, modest but whole. Then, when Zoe was 3, Elena was diagnosed with an aggressive illness that took her in less than a year, leaving Marcus alone with a toddler, a stack of medical bills that would take a decade to pay off, and a grief he had never fully let himself sit with because there had never been time to. He had spent the 3 years since then doing the only thing he knew how to do, showing up, every single day, for his daughter, even when showing up for himself felt impossible. Vivian Cross, meanwhile, had built exactly the empire she'd once sketched on napkins in that coffee shop corner booth. Cross Innovations had started as a scrappy 2-person logistics software startup, and had grown, over a decade of relentless, occasionally ruthless work, into one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country, with Vivian at 35 now, regularly named among the youngest self-made billionaires in the industry. She had everything the version of herself in that corner booth could have dreamed of. The corner, office on the 40th floor, the magazine covers, the board seats. What she didn't have, and had never quite managed to replace, was the particular ease of being known completely by another person, the way Marcus had once known her. She'd dated since him, briefly and carefully, but something always felt like a performance rather than a homecoming. She had told herself, more times than she could count, that she'd built a life too big and too complicated for anyone from her old life to fit back into it. She hadn't told herself, not honestly, how often she still thought about the boy from the coffee shop who used to memorize her order before she finished saying it. There had been a particular ritual Vivian never told anyone about, not even her closest executives. Every year, on the anniversary of that cold March conversation on the library bench, she allowed herself exactly one evening to think about Marcus properly, not the guarded, occasional flicker of memory she permitted herself the rest of the year, but a full, deliberate evening of it, usually spent alone in her apartment with a bottle of wine she rarely finished. She would wonder every year whether he'd graduated eventually, whether he'd found the life he deserved, whether he ever thought of her at all, or whether she'd suddenly become a closed chapter he'd filed away without much difficulty. She had hired, twice over the years, a discreet service to check whether he still lived in the same state, and both times had talked herself out of reaching out, telling herself that whatever had made him leave in the first place was still probably true, and that showing up uninvited in his life would only prove she'd have never really respected the space he'd asked for. She had built, in other words, was an entire private architecture of restraint around a single unanswered question. And she had never expected that question to simply step out of an elevator on an ordinary Thursday morning. That Thursday morning, Marcus and Zoe pushed through the revolving doors of Cross Tower into a lobby of polished dark marble and soaring glass, so vast and reflective that Zoe instinctively pressed closer to her father's side. The directory board near the elevator banks listed dozens of floors and company names in small, crowded print, and Marcus, running 7 minutes behind schedule and increasingly anxious, scanned it too quickly, misread the floor number for Meridian Facilities Group, and ushered Zoe into the nearest open elevator car just as the doors began sliding shut. It wasn't until the elevator had already climbed past the 20th floor, the numbers ticking upward far faster and further than he'd expected, that Marcus realized his mistake. He'd stepped into the express elevator reserved for the executive floors, Cross Innovations's, the private bank, not the general tenant elevators at all. By the time the doors chimed and slid open on the 40th floor, it was too late to simply ride back down unnoticed. A small crowd near the reception desk had already turned toward the sound of arriving doors, the way people do out of habit rather than intention. Marcus stepped out first, already halfway into an apology for the mix-up. Zoe's small hand still wrapped around his fingers. Biscuit clutched under her other arm. The reception area was breathtaking, in a way that made him feel instantly, uncomfortably out of place. Floor-to-ceiling windows framing the entire skyline. White stone floors so polished they nearly mirrored the ceiling. The hush of expensive quiet that money seems to buy for itself. And standing near the reception desk, mid-sentence with an assistant, a single leather portfolio, tucked under one arm, was a woman in a tailored navy blazer, whose face Marcus would have recognized anywhere, in any decade, in any lifetime. Vivian turned toward the sound of the elevator out of pure habit, the way she'd trained herself to do 100 times a day without thinking. And then she stopped moving entirely. Her assistant kept talking for a full 3 seconds, before realizing Vivian wasn't listening anymore. Vivian's hand rose slowly, almost involuntarily, toward her mouth, her composed executive expression cracking open into something raw and unguarded that seen in that office in years. Marcus froze mid-step, the apology dying in his throat, staring at a face that had aged into an even more striking version of the one he'd say to her, and failing not to remember. For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. The lobby around them seemed to hold its breath, the assistant glancing uncertainly between Amy and Self, a passing employee slowing his pace, sensing without understanding that he'd walked into the middle of something enormous. It was Zoe, in the end, who broke the silence, tugging gently on her father's sleeve and asking, in the small, matter-of-fact voice of a 6-year-old, whether the pretty lady was someone he knew. Marcus, still staring, managed only a single word: Vivian. Hearing her own name in his voice after a decade seemed to unstick something in Vivian's chest. She crossed the lobby toward him without seeming to decide to, stopping a few feet away, her eyes moving from his face, down to the small girl beside him, and back up again, 100 questions rising behind her eyes at once. "Marcus," she said quietly, her CEO composure nowhere in sight. "What are you doing here?" he explained, haltingly, embarrassed in a way he hadn't anticipated. The wrong elevator, the interview downstairs he was now certainly going to be late for, the mix-up with the directory board. He didn't explain the rest, not yet. The layoff, Elena, the years of struggling quietly to keep his small family afloat. He didn't need to. Vivian could see it plainly enough in the folder of resumes tucked under his arm, in the careful, mended patch on the elbow of his jacket, in the tired lines around eyes that used to light up every time he saw her walk into that coffee shop. She looked at him the way people look at a photograph they thought they'd lost, equal parts disbelief and ache. She invited them into her office, not as a courtesy, she made clear, but because she genuinely wasn't ready to let this moment end in a lobby with an audience. Her office, when they stepped inside, was as vast and quiet as the reception area, a single wall of glass overlooking the entire city. And yet within 30 seconds of sitting down, Zoe had wandered to the window, delighted, pressing Biscuit's paw against the glass to show him the tiny cars far below. And something about a 6-year-old's easy wonder seemed to soften the enormous, careful distance that 10 years and an empire had built between the two adults in the room. Vivian asked about Zoe first, gently, and Marcus told her, Elena, the illness, the 3 years since, the 4 months of unemployment that had brought him, however accidentally, to this exact elevator on this exact morning. He watched Vivian's composed expression falter more than once as he spoke, watched her hands tighten slightly around her coffee cup when he described the year Elena had been sick, watched something that looked almost like guilt cross her face when he mentioned, without dwelling on it, that he'd spent the last decade wondering whether ending things with her all those years ago had been the right decision, or simply the easiest one to justify to Bit himself at the time. Vivian, in turn, told him about the years he had in Awasi. The during led 2 brutal early years of cross-innovations, when she's moin shabidun. He wanted her first tiny office, because she couldn't afford both rent and payroll. The investors who doubted a 25-year-old woman running a logistics company, the nights she'd called her own mother crying, convinced the whole thing was about to collapse. She told him about the first time the company turned a real profit, and how her first instinct, humiliatingly, hadn't been to celebrate, but to reach for her phone to tell him, before remembering, all over again, that she couldn't. She told him this had happened more times over the following decade than she was comfortable, admitting big wins, hard losses, ordinary Tuesdays, each one accompanied by a small, involuntary impulse to share it with a person she had no right to still be thinking about. Vivian was quiet for a long moment after that, staring out at the skyline she'd spent a decade climbing toward. Then she told him something she had never said out loud to anyone, that she had built cross-innovations in no small part, as a way of proving to herself that she could survive losing something she'd once believed was permanent. That every milestone, every headline, every zero added to a valuation had felt, privately, like evidence she was gathering for an argument she never got to have with him, that she'd been enough, that leaving hadn't been necessary, that whatever fear had driven him away could have been survived together instead of alone. She said she'd told herself for 10 years that she'd made peace with how things ended. Standing across from him now, she admitted quietly, she wasn't sure that had ever been entirely true. Marcus, for his part, admitted the fear that had actually driven him away all those years ago. Not that he's man, but that he'd been terrified of watching that love curdle into resentment. Once the debts and the double shifts and his father's medical bills made him into someone smaller than the man she'd fallen for. He'd rather disappear with the memory of her loving him intact, he confessed, than stay and risk watching that love erode under the weight of everything he couldn't control. He said it had taken him years, and a marriage, and a devastating loss, and a rock-bottom morning, wandering into the wrong elevator, to finally understand how wrong that logic had been. That love, strong enough to matter, had never needed him to be anything other than exactly who he was, struggling included. There was a long silence after he said this, neither of them rushing to fill it, both simply sitting with the weight of 10 years, finally spoken honestly out loud. Zoe, still at the window, turned around at some point during the quiet and asked, without any sense of the enormity of the moment she'd wandered into, whether the pretty lady wanted to see Biscuit do his famous somersault trick. Vivian, eyes still wet, laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of her, and told Zoe she would love nothing more. And for a few minutes, the heaviness in the room dissolved into a 6-year-old's delighted narration of a stuffed bear's acrobatic career, giving both adults exactly the breathing room they needed before either of them had to decide what came next. It would have been easy, in a story like this, for everything to resolve itself in that single conversation, but real reconciliation rarely moves that quickly, and neither of them pretended it would. Vivian didn't offer him a job out of guilt or nostalgia, and Marcus, to his own surprise, found himself grateful she didn't. The last thing his fragile pride could have withstood that. Mourning was charity, dressed up as a second chance. Instead, she asked, carefully, if she could take both of them to lunch before he went downstairs for his interview, an offer that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with simply not being ready to let him walk back and out of her life, the way he'd walked out of it the first time. The weeks that followed weren't without friction. A junior member of Vivian's communications team, scrolling through a company blog comment section, noticed a photo someone had snapped of Vivian and Marcus at a park bench and flagged it, half-jokingly, as a potential story if it ever reached a tabloid. Vivian's chief of staff, a sharp, protective woman named Priya, who had worked with her since the earliest scrappy days of the company, pulled Vivian aside and asked, not unkindly, whether she'd thought through what it would mean for the company's image and her own credibility if the press painted the relationship as a billionaire's charity project, or, worse, painted Marcus as someone chasing her fortune, rather than her. Vivian had bristled at the question, more defensively than she intended, and it took her a full day to admit to herself that Priya wasn't entirely wrong to ask it, that she needed to be honest with herself about why she wanted Marcus back in her life, and equally honest about protecting him from a version of public scrutiny he'd never asked for and didn't deserve. Marcus, for his part, wrestled with a mirror version of the same fear. A coworker at his new maintenance job, half in jest, joked one afternoon about him marrying up now that he was apparently friendly with the CEO upstairs, and the comment lodged itself uncomfortably in Marcus's chest for days afterward. He found himself pulling back slightly from Vivian's texts, answering a beat too slowly, declining an invitation to a company event, with a flimsy excuse about Zoe's bedtime. It was Zoe, in her small, unfiltered way, who eventually called him out on it, asking one evening why he seemed sad every time Vivian's name came up, if Vivian made him happy. Marcus sat his daughter down, and, in the careful, simplified language he used for the hardest conversations, admitted that sometimes grown-ups get scared of good things too, worried that other people will think less of them for wanting something they haven't fully earned yet. Zoe considered this with the serious focus only a 6-year-old can bring to an adult problem, then told him that Biscuit didn't care if people thought his fur was old and worn, because the people who mattered loved him anyway. Marcus laughed for the first time in days, and called Vivian that same night. When he finally told her honestly what had been holding him back, Vivian didn't dismiss the fear the way he half expected her to. She told him she understood it better than he realized, that she'd spent a decade building a reputation for being unshakable, precisely because she was terrified of anyone seeing how much she still needed things, needed people, needed him. They agreed, that night, to stop performing certainty they didn't control, and instead simply tell each other the truth as it came, one uncertain day at a time. Priya, when she finally met Marcus properly a few weeks later, watched him patiently help Zoe build a blanket fort in Vivian's office during a late work night, and quietly told Vivian afterward that don't stop worrying about the optics. Some things, she said, didn't need managing, they just needed believing in. Over lunch at a small deli, 2 blocks from the tower, away from marble floors and glass elevators, something easier settled between them. Not the easy, uncomplicated love of two 22-year-olds anymore, but something steadier, forged by everything both of them had survived in the years apart. Zoe, delighted by the discovery of a stranger who let her order 2 desserts, chattered happily between them about Biscuit's many adventures, unknowingly filling the silences that might otherwise have felt too heavy to sit inside. Marcus made it to his interview 11 minutes late, breathless and apologetic, and got the job anyway, the hiring manager charmed despite himself by the honest, unpolished explanation Marcus gave for his tardiness. What began that Thursday didn't turn overnight into a fairy tale reunion. Vivian and Marcus spent the following months rebuilding something slower and more careful than either of them had rushed into at 22, first as friends who called each other more often than either had planned to, then gradually as something neither of them was in a hurry to name too quickly. Vivian met Zoe for ice cream some Saturdays, careful never to overstep, letting the relationship grow at the pace a 6-year-old needed, rather than the pace impatience might have preferred. Marcus, steady now in his new job, and slowly climbing out from under years of debt, found himself, for the first time since Elena's death, imagining a future that didn't feel like something he was simply enduring his way through. Months later, on a quiet evening in Vivian's apartment, smaller and warmer than her office, the one space in her life still untouched by boardrooms and headlines, Zoe fell asleep on the couch, between them during a movie, Biscuit tucked under her chin, and Vivian looked over at Marcus with an expression that held none of the guarded composure of that first morning in the lobby. She told him, quietly, that she didn't believe in fate. Not really. Not as a businesswoman who trusted data over destiny, but she's become willing to admit that some coincidences were simply too specific to dismiss. A wrong elevator, on the one morning in 10 years he happened to be in that building, arriving at the one floor where she happened to be standing. Marcus said he didn't believe in fate either, but he said he believed, now, in second chances built the slow, deliberate way, not handed to you by luck, but chosen. deliberately, every single day after. He carried Zoe carefully to the guest room that night, tucking the blanket around her the way he had 1,000 nights before. And when he came back out, Vivian was standing by the window, looking out at the city she'd spent a decade conquering. Looking, for the first time since he'd known her at either 22 or 35, entirely at peace, rather than driven. He came to stand beside her, and neither of them said much for a while, content simply to watch the lights of the city they'd both, in their separate and difficult ways, been trying to survive in for the past 10 years. Vivian eventually broke the silence to tell him something Priya had said to her weeks earlier, about not needing to manage everything, about some things simply needing to be believed in instead. She said she thought she finally understood what that meant, that for a decade she approached her whole life like a problem to be optimized, a company to be scaled, a loss to be outperformed, and that somewhere in the space of a few short months, Marcus and Zoe had quietly taught her something no boardroom ever could, that some of the best things that happen to you were never meant to be earned or engineered, only recognized and held onto when they arrive. Marcus told her that he'd spent 10 years thinking he'd protected her by walking away, and that it had taken him this long and this much loss to understand that the bravest thing he could have done back then, and the bravest thing he could do now, was simply to stay. They didn't rush toward any grand declarations that night. No promises neither of them was ready to make out loud yet. They simply stood together at the window, two people who had built entirely separate lives out of the wreckage of a decision made too young and too afraid, quietly discovering that the life they were building now, slowly and on purpose, felt sturdier than anything either of them had constructed alone. Somewhere down the hall, Zoe slept soundly with Biscuit tucked under her chin, unaware that the small, ordinary elevator ride she'd taken with her father one Thursday morning had rewritten the shape of both their futures. If this story reminded you that the people we lose touch with sometimes find their way back exactly when we need them most, take a second right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this one are exactly what we've one here to tell, and there are so many more waiting for you. Sometimes the biggest turning point in your life isn't a plan you made. Sometimes it's a wrong elevator, a nervous morning, and the courage to say someone's name out loud after 10 years of silence. Thank you for watching until the very end, and we'll see you in the next story.